Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have the distinct honor of introducing Denis McDonough, who is President Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor. He was appointed to this position by President Obama in October 2010. Prior to that, he served as Chief of Staff of the National Security Council and also as Director of Strategic Communications. Denis entered the White House with President Obama after serving as Senior Advisor on foreign policy issues in the President's transition team and on President Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. Prior to that, he was a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, an American Washington-based think tank. And he had a distinguished career in the Congress, where he rose to the position of Foreign Policy Advisor to Senator Tom Daschle when he was the Senate Democratic leader. To understand how close Denis McDonough is to President Obama, I thought I would simply quote the President himself. He said, "For years, I have counted on Denis McDonough's expertise and counsel on national security issues. He possesses a remarkable intellect, irrepressible work ethic, and a sense of collegiality that has earned him the respect of his colleagues." In short, we are very fortunate today to have with us a foreign policy counselor to the President from his inner circle in the White House. So please welcome to the podium Deputy National Security Advisor Denis McDonough.
Martin, thank you very much for that very kind and overly generous introduction. It's good to see so many friends here. Tamara, as I just said to you, it's particularly good to see you. We miss you. I prefer to see you in the Situation Room, as I just told you, but it's nice to see you here too. And I'm always privileged to work in an office that flies the American flag, but also especially privileged to travel with our Foreign Service overseas. And let me just say, Ambassador Ziadeh, thank you for being here with me today. Thank you for all you do every day. I want to mention a couple of additional thank yous to Steve Grand, who you all know very well and who I've known for an awful long time, Shadi Hamid, Salman Sheikh, and everybody at the Brookings Center. Thank you very much for inviting me and for the great conference that you've put together. Let me just mention a few distinguished guests among a very distinguished list of attendees. Rashad, it's great to see you. Thank you for all your terrific work. The work you do to tighten the ties between the United States and the Islamic world is absolutely critical to our efforts. The President appreciates that. Let me acknowledge also Imam Majid, a fine scholar, a great advocate for tolerance and ecumenism, as is another attendee and a very good friend of mine, His Eminence Cardinal McCarrick, whom I don't see, but there he is. Very good friends. Finally, let me extend President Obama's gratitude to His Highness Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani and His Excellency the Prime Minister Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim Al Thani for hosting this important dialogue. On behalf of the President, I would like to convey our deepest sympathies to the families of those who lost their lives on Monday in the tragic fire in the mall. When the Emir visited President Obama last spring in Washington, the President was impressed with his leadership on issues in the region like Syria and Libya, and on global issues like food security and on climate. It's fitting that you gather again in Doha this year after coming to Washington last year. Doha is at the geographic crossroads of the Islamic world, which stretches from Marrakesh to Kuala Lumpur. In the United States, we're proud to be the home to more than 3 million Muslims. So perhaps I should say that the Muslim world stretches from Minneapolis, in my home state of Minnesota, which is represented in the United States Congress by a proud Muslim American congressman, to Kuala Lumpur. The theme of this year's forum is also timely. Across the Middle East and North Africa, a new generation is rising, raising its voice and seeking new direction. The challenges and opportunities of this change are something that President Obama understands very well. In fact, bringing about change has been central to his life and public service, and it shapes his approach to American foreign policy, especially in this region. Consider that in 2009, many of our relationships across this region were either frayed or stagnant. We are weighed down by 2 wars. Osama bin Laden was still on the run. Iran believed itself ascendant, and the prospect of real democratic reform in the region seemed to be a distant dream. What a difference 3 years makes. Today, let me focus on 3 areas of that particular change where the relationship between the United States and this region is changing particularly. First, President Obama is fulfilling his promise to move the United States beyond a decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, even as we continue to meet the very real threat of al-Qaeda. In his speech in Cairo, President Obama said he would remove all of our troops from Iraq by 2012. This, like so much of his other accomplishments, is exactly what the United States did. The last American troops left Iraq in December. For the first time in 9 years, there are no Americans fighting in Iraq. Now, instead, we're building an enduring partnership to advance the security and prosperity of the Iraqi people. In Afghanistan, we are also winding down a war. As a result of the good work of coalition troops and Afghan security forces, President Karzai recently announced that 75% of all Afghans now live in areas that are in the process of transitioning to Afghan security forces lead. At the NATO summit last week in Chicago, our allies and partners, a group of more than 50 nations, unified behind the plan to begin to bring the war to a responsible close. Afghan forces will be in the lead for combat operations across the country by next year, and by the end of 2014 will be fully responsible for security across the entire country. As we responsibly end the war in Afghanistan, we've also learned the lessons of 1989 in that country. We've signaled our long-term commitment to Afghanistan through the Strategic Partnership Agreement that Presidents Obama and Karzai signed earlier this month in Kabul. In that partnership, we committed to support Afghanistan's social and economic development, security, institutions, and regional cooperation. In return, the Afghan government committed to strengthen accountability, transparency, oversight, and to protect the human rights of all Afghans, men and women, boys and girls. This progress in Iraq and Afghanistan is changing America's military footprint in this region. 4 years ago, the United States had 180,000 troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've already cut that number by more than half, and as more Afghans step up, more of our forces will come home. In words and deeds, we are turning the page on a decade of war and bringing about a new chapter of engagement with Iraq, Afghanistan, and, as you've all discussed the last couple days, Muslim communities around the globe. We're under no illusions about how hard these wars have been, both for our own troops and for the citizens who have lived through them. What cannot be denied, however, is that positive change can be seen in Afghanistan and Iraq. Both countries now have the opportunity to affirm their own sovereignty and shape their own future. In Iraq, if the country's leaders choose to govern for all Iraqis rather than themselves, there is a remarkable potential to create new wealth and opportunity. For the first time in decades, a democratically elected partnership government brings together all the major blocs, and the multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian military answers to the civilians. To be sure, the partnership government is unwieldy and fraught with tension, and success will require difficult compromise. But the fact is that politics has supplanted violence as the means by which each group seeks to protect and advance its own interests. And in Afghanistan, we're hopeful that as we complete the security transition I just talked about, a political process can reconcile Afghans with one another. and allow the Afghan people to live in the peace that has eluded them now for far too long, while protecting the gains for women and girls especially of the last decade. At the same time, we are winning the war against al-Qaeda. Since the beginning of this administration, we've made it clear that we are not at war with Islam, which is a great world religion, nor are we at war with terrorism, which is a tactic. We are at war with al-Qaeda, an organization whose only aim is to destroy, not build. An organization whose attacks have resulted in the deaths of innocent men, women, and children, the vast majority of whom have been Muslim. What some have dubbed the long war, we have instead made a much more focused and precise war. The death of bin Laden was our most strategic blow yet against al-Qaeda and has enabled us to put al-Qaeda on a pathway to defeat. In Pakistan, al-Qaeda's leadership has continued to suffer heavy losses. We've put the leadership core in the tribal regions on the path to defeat. In other areas, we will continue to work with our partners to deliver blows against al-Qaeda affiliates, like al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But more importantly, we believe that the changes that are sweeping across the region, where a new generation is peacefully affecting the change that al-Qaeda's senseless violence could never bring, will continue driving al-Qaeda and its tired narrative further into irrelevance. Last week at our Air Force Academy, President Obama described how, even as we've done the work of ending these wars, we've laid the foundation for a new era of American leadership, an era where we work with other nations using all elements of our power: diplomatic, economic, development, and the power of our ideals. You see this new, broader engagement around the world, and you see it particularly in this region. Of course, this shift away from war comes at a time when this region is undergoing profound change. President Obama views this intersection as a tremendous opportunity for the United States and our partners in the region to focus on a new affirmative agenda. With the end of these wars and broader American engagement, we have an unprecedented opportunity to focus more closely on the challenges that matter most to millions of people in their daily lives: how to provide a brighter future for all of our children, how to confront and end global poverty, how to fight corruption, promote good governance, enhance political reform, human rights, and economic growth. What's clear about the events of the past year and a half is that change has now come to the region. And importantly, there is no turning back. There are now 4 countries undergoing democratic transitions: Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. For the first time, the Egyptian people went to the polls just last week to vote in an election for president where they had a very real choice. This election marks an important milestone in Egypt's transition to democracy, and we look forward to working with whomever the Egyptian people elect as their president in the runoff next month. The Libyan people are preparing for their first democratic election in the history of their country, and the Tunisians are drafting a new constitution. There are, of course, risks in the Arab Spring. Change is difficult, and it is never linear. The transitions underway face enormous challenges. It will take decades, not years, decades, for the change unleashed in the streets of Tunis and Tahrir Square to play out. New governments will be tested by the circumstances and will be judged by their actions. There are high expectations among their people to deliver swiftly on the promises of these revolutions and these new times. So let me speak candidly about the role of the United States. First, history will show that we stood on the side of change from the beginning of these events. We embraced the transformation in Tunisia. We sided with the aspirations of citizens on the streets in Egypt, even though the United States knew very well the leader that was overthrown, because we believe that Egypt is made stronger by electing a government that is responsive to its people. We led an intervention to protect the people of Libya. We worked diligently for months, literally months, to support the transition of power that has taken place in Yemen. And in countries like Bahrain, which I just visited, Morocco, and Jordan, we have been advocates for reform. And in Syria, we stand for the dignity of the Syrian people, who deserve a new government that represents its citizens instead of killing them. As the President made clear last May, the United States has a long-standing core national interest in the region that endure. These interests will endure, and we will continue to aggressively engage, including the preservation of the peace treaty with Israel, maintaining the free flow of commerce, preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, and disrupting terrorist threats. But we also affirm, as the President did last May, our interest in the success of the change that is sweeping the region. There should be no doubt the United States has a vital national interest in the consolidation of democratic change and the emergence of governments that are more responsive to their people. The theory that repressive rule was a recipe for stability has fundamentally been proven wrong. It was, in fact, a path, as we've seen, to instability. Unless the foundations of the rule of law, accountability, transparency, and justice are strengthened, the region risks falling behind the rest of the world. Until reforms are made to advance inclusive economic growth, attract private investment, increase trade, and cultivate entrepreneurship, the next generation will find itself increasingly difficult and unable to compete in a global economy. Indeed, we have seen in other regions how these processes are interdependent. Freedom, dignity, transparency, and accountability are the necessary components for sustainable growth and stability. I know there's a debate, including among all of you here in this conference over the last couple of days, about what role the United States has played and should play in this part of the world where history is so complex and, in candor, so close at hand. On one hand, there are those who advocate more direct U.S. involvement to help solve problems. On the other are still others who do not want the United States to meddle in the affairs of these or any other countries. So let me be very clear. When we say we are not going to determine the destiny of change, we mean what we say. It's not up to America to determine the region's leaders or write your constitutions. We respect, and we will continue to respect, the will of the people. We will work with whomever you elect, provided they respect universal rights. At the same time, we're prepared to be a partner. That is why President Obama said in May last year that if you take the risks that reform entails, you will have the full support of the United States. This is manifest in the political partnerships we're building with newly elected governments and the economic support we're providing countries in the transition. Over the past year, we have already mobilized $800 million to support transitions and lay foundations for sustained progress. Looking ahead, we'll build on this, including through our proposed Middle East and North Africa initiative, an incentive fund, designed in part to support the efforts of those governments with the political will to commit to democratic change, build effective institutions, and take the often difficult steps needed to sustain broad-based economic growth. We're leveraging other economic tools as well, including loan guarantees, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and we are continuing to enlist the help of international community, as the President did just last weekend at Camp David with the G8 Deauville Partnership to reinforce our efforts. The President's made clear that America will lead on behalf of human dignity and freedom. We do so not just because it's at the core of who we are as Americans, but because it's also in our interests. Our closest allies and partners around the world are democracies. And in this sense, in the most basic terms, the United States of America is bound fundamentally to the Arab Spring. Earlier this month, I told another audience that the Arab Spring also plays to America's comparative and competitive strengths: respect for the individual, freedom of expression and assembly, innovation, and entrepreneurship. It's important to remember that America itself was born out of revolution against an empire. We know what it means to construct a nation, to draft a constitution, to live by its mandate, to go to the polls, to build political parties. But those are just the mechanics of democracy. The test of all democracies is ultimately whether they can hold themselves accountable. New governments emerging in the Middle East and North Africa will need to put in place their own checks and balances, protect and empower the weakest among them, ensure peaceful transfers of power between democratically elected governments, and celebrate, not fear, civil society. Unfortunately, fear and brute force remains the currency of the Assad regime in Syria, a regime fundamentally at odds with the democratic forces sweeping the region. The violence the regime has perpetrated on the Syrian people negates any claim to legitimacy. The most recent and appalling of the regime's many atrocities was the Hula massacre, substantially, overwhelmingly, of women and children, just this last weekend. You've all heard the claims that local vigilantes, known as Shabiha, committed over 100 murders and over 300 maimings in that town on Saturday, and that the regime itself bears no responsibility. This is a lie. We know that the regime controls the actions of the Shabiha and pays the salaries, and regime insiders pay the salaries of those thugs. President Obama has made our position on Syria imminently clear, but it bears repeating. First, we will continue to support the UN Security Council efforts to find a political solution to end the violence and lay the foundation for a democratic transition through Joint Special Envoy Kofi Annan's efforts. However, it is our belief, and evidence of this is mounting, that putting monitors into the country is not simply going to stop the violence. There needs to be a credible political transition process that gets underway. Second, we will also continue to work outside the United Nations with like-minded partners to increase pressure on the Assad regime through broad implementation of sanctions and through diplomatic isolation. The Friends of Syria group continues to work to undermine the political, military, and economic powers that have kept the Syrian people divided against one another and the Assad regime in power. Third, we're strangling the regime economically, and we'll tighten our concerted efforts to do so at the Friends of Syria meeting in Washington on June 6. Our objectives, and we're moving closer to them, are straightforward. Starve the regime of the resources it requires to pay the army and deprive Assad's cronies of the money they need to buy the Shabiha's brutal conspiracy. As part of our efforts, we'll continue to strengthen the Syrian people through our provision of non-lethal assistance, including communications and medical equipment to the political opposition. Finally, we will continue our work to lead the world to address the humanitarian situation and provide emergency humanitarian aid to the people of Syria. No one can know exactly when or how, but this much is certain. The Syrian people will indeed find justice. Like so many despotic regimes before it, the Assad clique will end up ultimately in the dustbin of history, and the people of Syria will have a chance to determine their own destiny. When that happens, it will also be the most profound strategic setback that Syria's closest ally, Iran, has faced in decades. That is surely why Iran has provided material support and advice to the regime in brutalizing the Syrian people. This weekend's admission from Tehran that, quote, if the Islamic Republic was not present in Syria, the massacre of the people would have happened on a much larger scale, is remarkable, though less so than the subsequent backtracking on official media sites that sought to cover up this earlier and stunning admission. The result of this cynical assistance has only further alienated Iran from the region. It's one more example of how Iran's leaders are fundamentally out of step with the region and with the world. Since taking office, President Obama has made it clear that the United States is prepared to work with Iran, both on its rights and its responsibilities as a member of the international community. For the past 3.5 years, we've offered Iran's leaders a choice. Meet your international obligations and rejoin the community of nations, or continue to flout your responsibilities and face even greater isolation and pressure. At every turn, Iran's leaders have rejected logical, reasonable approaches to resolving the world's concerns about its nuclear program. At every turn, they have failed to seize the multiple opportunities before them. As a result, the international community is now more unified than ever. The world has imposed the strongest sanctions on Iran to date, which we believe is the reason they've returned, finally, to negotiation. We pursue this path not only because it's in the interest of preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, which would have grave consequences for the security of this region and the world. We do so because we support the aspirations of the Iranian people, especially its young people, who deserve a future much better than the one their leaders are creating for them by failing to live up to these international responsibilities. That brings me back to the theme of this year's forum, New Voices, and to the most important message I want to leave with the audience today. The United States and the Islamic world have to work together to right the ship for their generations that follow. As you all know, over 60% of the region is under 30. Several countries have 30% or more of the population between the ages of 15 and 29, with some median ages dipping below 20. And even when the proportion of youth is dropping, the numbers will be rising for decades to come, requiring tens of millions of new jobs to employ these young people. On top of this demographic challenge, the new generation is more empowered, connected, and vocal than any of its predecessors. Their expectations for civic and economic opportunity are rising, and we must all find a way to fulfill the aspirations. Having driven several of the revolutions around the region, youth have shown their ability to shape public debate and challenge traditional order. But ensuring their political participation, economic opportunity, and voice is essential to addressing both political and the economic issues in the region going forward. Where youth aspire to build stable and prosperous societies, the United States will stand with those aspirations and do everything it can to support them. As the President said in Cairo, equipping this new generation for success in the 21st century will require providing the necessary education and skills, unlocking the potential of the region's girls and young women, and fostering a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation. Since then, since the Cairo speech, the United States has prioritized engaging with this group and helping to marshal the best of American higher education, innovation, and society as partners in this effort. On education, we've brokered dozens of partnerships between leading United States institutions and universities throughout the Muslim world. We've expanded scholarship to enable students to access education in their own communities as well as in the United States. In the 2 years after President Obama's commitment in Cairo, the United States increased the number of Middle Eastern and North African students studying in the U.S. by 25%. But we don't simply see this as a one-way exchange. Our citizens have much to learn from the institutions and young people in this region. In the years after the Cairo address, the number of U.S. students in the Middle East and North Africa has grown by 35%. We've heard the desire among youth and governments alike to expand English teaching to ensure young people are equipped with this critical skill to succeed in the global economy. We've expanded our English teaching programs 40% to now directly hire 20,000 students across the Muslim world and thousands of teachers of English. We've launched entrepreneurship and vocational skills training, programs to ensure that skills that youth acquire enable them to find economic opportunity in the workforce, helping to build innovative businesses. We expand partnerships with industry associations and the private sector to help ensure that students graduate with the skills needed by the market. We are pairing young entrepreneurs with business mentors in the United States and run business plan competitions, seeking young people's best and brightest ideas. And finally, we also recognize that the youth are not merely calling for education and better job opportunities. They are calling for dignity. This demands a role in deciding the future of their societies. We all have an interest in making sure that the enthusiasm and interest displayed over the past 2 years does not atrophy, or worse, sour. But make no mistake, the United States can only be a partner in this endeavor. It's up to the leaders in this room and Muslim communities around the world to take seriously the opportunities as well as the challenges presented by this new, young, and growing generation. So in closing, I want to go back to something I said at the beginning. President Obama views the intersection of events in the region as an unbelievable and unprecedented opportunity for all of us. I know that some people in the region, in fact, some people in the room, for them, the promise of the President's Cairo speech is yet to be fulfilled. I share that view. As President Obama has said, we knew that his vision would not be fulfilled in a single year or even in several years. But we knew we had to begin, and that all of us have to take our part of the responsibilities to fulfill. At the end of that speech in Cairo, here's what he said. We have a responsibility to join together on behalf of the world we seek, a world where extremists no longer threaten our people, and American troops have come home, a world where Israelis and Palestinians each secure in a state of their own, and nuclear energy is used for peaceful purposes, a world where governments serve their citizens, and the rights of all of God's children are respected. That is the world we seek, but we can only achieve it together. I can tell you today that President Obama firmly believes that those continue to be shared interests, and that working together in partnership, we can achieve them. So much progress has been made in the last 3 years, but there is much, much yet to be done. While the road we must take will be long and at sometimes arduous, I'm confident that we'll be able to achieve the world we seek if we move forward in the spirit of mutual interest and mutual respect. So thank you all very much for the opportunity to talk with you today. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much, Denis, for that comprehensive and compelling statement of U.S. policy. We have, I'm told by our ambassador, all of 15 minutes for Q&A. So I'm going to take 3 questions together and then we'll see where we go. Yes, please. And please identify yourself.
Thank you. I'm Roy Safi. I'm professor of political science here in Doha with the Qatar Foundation. And also I am a member of the Syrian National Council. My question to you is there a B plan for Syria? We have seen how the Annan plan has not worked. The regime continued to bombard cities and towns. Are there other ideas how to stop the killing in Syria?
Trudy?
Trudy Rubin from the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'm just following up on the previous question. After the massacre at Hula, do you see any greater willingness on the part of Moscow to put pressure on the Assad regime? And there's been talk in the media about a Yemen-ski variant. Given the differences between the societies, is there a Yemen-ski variant that's being considered, and how would that experience apply, again, given the great differences in the regimes?
Do we have a question that's not on Syria? Over there, please.
I wanted to start by thanking you so much by acknowledging...
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sahar Aziz. I'm a law professor at Texas Wesleyan School of Law and also the president of the Egyptian American Rule of Law Association. I want to thank you for the comment reminding everyone that there is no war between Islam and the West, and the more you can say that in the United States, I think the better. But there are some concerns that the way that American Muslims are treated are a litmus test of the genuine concern or interest in building relationships with Muslims abroad. And there have been certain things that have happened recently, such as systemic surveillance of Muslims by the NYPD. There have been some issues or concerns with entrapment and essentially counterterrorism policies, particularly in the prosecution context, that have caused some doubts as to whether certain parts of the government are in fact treating American Muslims in a way that does reinforce the Islam versus West paradigm. And so I was hoping that perhaps you could comment on that issue. Thank you.
I said three, but I saw Nabil Fahmy wants to ask a question, so we get to sneak one in on Egypt,
Good.
if you're okay with that.
Good. I'll answer quickly, too.
Thank you. I'm Nabil Fahmy. I'm the Dean of the School of Global Affairs at the American University in Cairo. I found your reference to the Cairo speech rather intriguing towards the end of the comment. Is that a commitment to pursue the Palestinian question in the second term if re-elected?
I thought it was going to be a question on Egypt, sorry. Go ahead, Dennis.
So let me work backwards on these. We'll continue to pursue the Israeli-Palestinian question as we do every day. I'm not in the business of making any promises for a second term. I don't even know if there'll be a second term. We're focused on that. Others are focused on that. But as the president has said, on any given day, this is a huge priority for him. It was an issue that he lifted up in his first days in the Oval Office, and there's not a day that goes by that he's not personally engaged in. It's a supremely nettlesome challenge. But as with all, that's the way it should be with all things that are as important as this is. So as it relates to the question about the treatment of American Muslims, I think it is fair to look at the huge success of American Muslims in the United States as indicative of the opportunities that are presented as much by Catholic or Irish Americans, as I am proudly, as by Muslim Americans. I'm very proud of the kind of opportunities that American Muslims have seized and taken charge of. The numbers, the President went through this in the Cairo speech, the numbers on education levels, per capita income, opportunity, and access are all absolutely phenomenal and speak as much to our system as they do to the hard work and dedication and the patriotism of American Muslims. As it relates to ongoing challenges as a result of either CT policy generally or concerns in popular culture more specifically, you listed a couple of important examples. I think we've been heard on each of those, and it's a reminder that, as the President has said, we're continuing to struggle toward a more perfect union all the time. So I don't have a particular reaction to any of the questions laid down on surveillance. We've been heard on that, or on discrimination. I can tell you that we continue to prioritize opportunities for all Americans, and I think the progress in the Muslim American community in particular is something that I know Muslim Americans are rightly proud of, and that we as a country should show off to the rest of the world as an example of what can happen in our country. Lastly, on Syria, as it relates to what the Plan B is for Syria, we're still on Plan A. The Annan plan is part of Plan A, but we're not betting the farm on the Annan plan. In fact, I indicated as much in the speech. You and the Syrian National Council and your colleagues are part of Plan A. Our continuing effort to work with the Friends of Syria. We have a meeting next week in Washington on enhanced sanctions implementation and enforcement. Earlier today, in fact, in the last 20 minutes or so, we and the government of Qatar have announced a new set of designations on a Syrian international bank that's been involved in funding nefarious activity. We will continue to robustly, patiently, but aggressively implement sanctions to further isolate the Assad regime, leading ultimately to the kind of transition, whether it's, as Trudy pointed out in the New York Times reported, a Yemensky alternative, or whether it's a different change. What we do know is that President Assad has forfeited his right to continue to claim legitimacy to lead Syria. This weekend's killings are grisly and horrific, but sadly unsurprising given his conduct over the last several months. So this is obviously going to be, again, another clarion call for the international community to redouble our efforts. We feel like we are making progress with our international partners, to include the Russians, but this is a perfect example of us not wanting to trumpet policy success until we have the objective and the outcome that we're looking for. So do I think, Trudy, that we've broken through with the Russians? Time will tell on that. Do I think that there's an alternative for a pacted transition like the one that we've seen in Yemen? Time will tell on that. What were the attributes that made Yemen transition work that we can apply to Syria? First of all, I just start with the disclaimer that the president started with in his speech on the Arab Spring in May of 2011, as well as his speech at NDU in April of 2011. Each of the transitions is going to be different because each of these countries is richly different. One thing that won't be different, though, is our dedication to the effort. And the Yemen effort was painstaking and took place over the course of many, many months with many twists and turns. I can tell you that this is a fundamental, vital national security of ours, national security interest of ours, and we're approaching it with the robust and aggressive pursuit of that objective that you would associate with vital national security interests. Because what's quite clear, and last week's violence in Lebanon, this weekend's horrible, grisly, brutal attack in Hula, underscore that the longer this goes on, the more extreme it's going to get, and the greater negative impact it will have on the region and on our interests. So we're approaching it with the urgency that a situation like that would require.
So I'm told we can have one more question. It's Hisham Halia down the back there.
Thank you very much. You probably noticed in the last few days within Egypt, the elections have produced a rather surprising result, and people are now talking about whether or not they support one candidate over the other and so on, creating quite a large amount of polarization. But one factor hasn't really been discussed, at least at this conference yet, and that's the role of the military in that future transition. A military that has quite a large and extensive relationship with the United States, and there have been calls to make that relationship a bit more conditional and bring to the forefront certain assurances about good governance and so forth. And I was wondering if you could comment on that for the benefit of this audience.
Yeah. So let me just say, reiterate. I said twice in the speech, and I reiterate again that the choice in Egypt's presidential elections is for Egyptians alone. We are committed to working with whomever is elected in that election. As it relates to our long-term relationship with the Egyptian military, it's a very important relationship to us. We think that over the course of many decades, it's been in the interest of the Egyptian people as well as the interest of the United States to have had that relationship and to have developed it in the way that we have. How exactly that relationship develops in the days, weeks, and months ahead and years ahead will not be driven by conditions necessarily that we put on that relationship, but will be driven by our ongoing interests in working with all the institutions in Egypt, will be governed by the relationship that we develop with the new civilian leadership in Egypt. And I think it's would be premature for us to start putting conditions on that relationship until we've seen how all this has developed and played forward. I will say that the conduct of the election, at least as I've seen reported in terms of witness accounts from the witnesses provided by the Carter Center, by some others that we've seen as a result of reporting of international embassies in Egypt, is that the election itself was conducted pretty fair and square. I think that's something that the Egyptian people and the Egyptian institutions ought to be very proud of. But again, we're not going to leapfrog ahead of developments on the ground. But we have a lot of friends in Egypt among all the institutions. And those are friendships that we have earned, worked hard at over the years, and we intend to keep.
Denis, unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there.
I'm going to just exercise my own, since I went on a little bit. Why don't we take two more and then we'll get going, okay?
Rashida, please identify yourself.
I'm Raghida Dargamud Al Haya. I just was wondering, when did you conclude, as you said, that events in Syria would be, once the Syrian people determine their destiny, it's the most profound strategic setback to Iran, as you said. Did you conclude that after the events in Lebanon recently, after Hola, before? Can you just shed some light also on the conversation you're having with the Russians on what Rudy mentioned, the Yemeni-style sort of exit? Are they engaging? Do they have conditions? What do they want? What do the Russians want?
Yeah, I'll leave it to the Russians to characterize their position. I will say that what we've said to them in private is exactly what we said to them in public, which is that the Assad regime has lost its legitimacy to lead. That we don't believe it's in Russia's interest to be associated with the Assad regime, and certainly not in the interest of the region for this kind of barbaric activity to continue. So our public message is no different than our private message is no different than our public message in that regard. As it relates to the Iranians, this is not a new view of ours. It's what we've noticed is that as a result of quite startlingly, actually positively in my view, out of the Baghdad talks, the P5+1 were very unified last week, notwithstanding very aggressive effort by our Iranian counterparts to try to drive wedges between and separate the six parties on our side of the table. That's indicative of the kind of isolation that Iran right now faces, having a very hard time getting access to hard currency, seeing, in fact, its oil exports decrease at rates of significant reduction of the types that we've talked about as a government over the course of the last several months. And in this period of increasing isolation, there's always been one place that the Iranians have been able to turn to for support, and only one place, frankly, and that's Syria. I think you see now the impact you see why we conclude that the fall of the Assad regime would have a very significant impact on a country who really in the region is only able to rely on one country, namely Syria, to support its efforts. So we think it'd be a strategic step back for the Iranians, but most importantly, it'd be a great opportunity for the Syrian people to have the kind of leadership that they have, frankly, have every right to expect, and frankly, which we believe they deserve.
Last one, yes? One more? Denis?
Yeah,
Take one
absolutely.
more?
Sorry,
Oh,
I thought you were pointing at somebody saying yes.
David Sapstein.
I'm David Saperstein. I represent the social policy arm of the Reformed Jewish movement in the United States. Denis, I'd like to step back from current events. We had a rich discussion before, a fascinating discussion before you came in about the relationship of religion and politics in our country. You came to the White House with deep engagement and knowledge with religion and religious ideas. Whichever you're more comfortable, can you reflect for a few minutes on how your own religious values and sensibilities have shaped your public service, or insights that you've gained in the last few years about the role of religion in American foreign policy?
Thanks, David. It's really good to see you, by the way. Look, I have 10 brothers and sisters, and one is a Catholic priest, another one is a former Catholic priest, and I can tell you that we had, shall we say, rich discussions about politics and religion around the kitchen table at supper time. But you know, let me just say two things. It was hard not to be thinking about this a lot as I was up in Bahrain over the course of the last 30 hours or so. but also seeing so many of my friends here, His Eminence, Rashad, Imam Majid, Farah, seeing so many of my friends and counterparts in this effort. I've also, with whom I've shared a lot of thoughts about this, I can't help but think about it. But there's two ways I think for me that I address it. One is to get hung up in what I consider the excuses of religion to feed conflict. I think oftentimes when people talk about religiously fueled conflict, they're really talking about what I call religious entrepreneurs who misuse religion to fuel conflict. And I prefer not to look at the misuse of religion, but look at where the places that we can use it as effectively as we can. And one thing that is absolutely true and is quite apparent throughout the Arab Spring countries is, and this is a concept the president talks an awful lot about and has since I've known him, and that's the concept of dignity. Dignity is infused in each of us, not because of anything we've done or anything we've said or anything we've learned. It's the teaching of all of our religions, of everybody in this room, that we're dignified because we're made in the image of God. When we focus on that shared, truthful, and realistic manifestation of our religious beliefs, we're going to get an awful lot farther than if we focus on the invented conflicts or the misuse of religion for conflict, as is frankly just too often the case now. So dignity is an issue that fundamentally informs what the president's doing across the board on a number of issues, but it's an issue that, as I said, that I've talked with him since I first got to know him in about 2005. And it's a hugely powerful concept that everybody in this room, frankly, lives. And the challenge for policymakers is to fight through the invented conflicts around religion to get to the true basis of religion. That's true across the board, whether you're, whatever your tradition is, certainly is part of my tradition. And believe me, when you've got 10 brothers and sisters running around your house, you're looking for something to make you different from each other. So I'm just counting on the whole dignity thing, David. So.
Denis, on behalf of the audience here, I want to say a very special thank you to you for making the effort to be with us, for coming such a distance, and for being so candid in expressing the President's policies on these critical issues. And
great,
we're
thanks.
very grateful to you. Thank you very much.
Thank
Could
you, Martin.
you please stay in your seats? We're going to resume the long conversation as soon as we escort Denis out. Thank you.